twilight on a ridgeline in central Appalachia. The wind threads through chestnut ghosts and laurel thickets, carrying an old rumor with a new edge. There were people up here who fit nowhere and everywhere at once. Not black, not white, not Indian, yet carrying pieces of each like heirlooms tucked under the tongue. The neighbors had a word for them, Melungeons, a name thrown like a stone before anyone agreed what it meant. Was it French for mixture, a curse from far-off tongues, or just the mountain's way of saying other? Court ledgers called them troublesome. Preachers called them unbaptizable. Politicians called them not white enough. But the hills wrote a different ledger, Collins, Gibson, Goins, Mullins, families weaving themselves into the hard soil of Newman's Ridge and the dim blue of Blackwater Valley. Olive skin that browned like copper under July sun. Dark hair, sometimes blue eyes that caught dusk and held it. They farmed poor land, hunted harder country, and learned the etiquette of survival. Speak little, marry close, keep your papers ready or your head down. Where did they come from? Sailors blown inland on a centuries-old wind? Moors, Turks, Portuguese, Mediterranean ghosts walking Appalachian switchbacks? Or were they the mountain's own children, born at the crossings where native paths, African routes, and European roads rubbed against one another until the map blurred? Folklore chose the answers it liked best. Science kept sharpening its knife. Meanwhile, the law did what law does, drew a line, then used it to push. This is not just genealogy, it's a Gothic household drama staged on ridges and in courthouses. It's whispered marriages and names altered by one letter. It's a school board that says, no, a jury that says, not white, and a Sunday rumor that says, not right. It's the stubborn pride of people who refuse to vanish and the fear of neighbors who needed them to. And it's the story of America told sideways, how belonging is negotiated, priced, and sometimes stolen. Tonight, we walk the old roads into Melungeon country, through slur and secret, through archive and DNA, listening for what the mountains will admit and what they will only hint. If this history grips you, like and subscribe. We begin where the name itself casts the first shadow. It starts with ink, county ledgers, court minutes, tax rolls that smelled of dust and long summers. In the 1800s across Hancock and neighboring counties, clerks needed categories more than they needed truth. Besides surnames you still hear on Newman's Ridge, Collins, Gibson, Goins, Mullins, appeared a word that did not describe so much as decide, Melungeon. It arrived like a stamp, closing doors with the force of a single syllable. No one can say with certainty where the word came from, only what it did. Some hear French in it, mélange, a mixture, tidy on paper, cruel in practice. Others trace it to Turkish or Arabic, Melungeon, the cursed soul, a folk etymology that tells you more about fear than linguistics. A few point toward Portuguese seafaring slang, the echo of ship-borne wanderers blown inland until the ocean was only a rumor in their blood. Each theory carries a lantern, none reaches the back wall of the cave. What the documents show instead is usage, Melungeon as label, charge, and verdict. In an Appalachian courthouse, names were more than names. They were keys or locks. To be called Melungeon was to find your life suddenly sorted on the wrong side of a line. A clerk could copy the word into a margin and watch it multiply consequences, a vote held back, a deed contested, a marriage license delayed until color could be argued into something the law recognized. Teachers learned the word as an instruction, juries learned it as suspicion, neighbors learned it as permission. The mountains have their own borders, ridges, rivers, saddles, but this border was bureaucratic and mobile, a line that could follow you into church, school, and market and make each doorway narrower. Outside the courthouse the word worked like a rumor that had found a uniform. Melungeon passed from lips to porches to pews, gathering thorns as it rolled, talk of witchcraft, of strange blood, of families who married too close because the outside would not marry them at all. The term wore two faces at once, slur and secret. Spoken at you, it stung. Spoken among your own, it became code, us and them, a way to carry each other through the days when papers and people agreed you belonged nowhere cleanly. The hills noticed, because hills notice everything. Newman's Ridge and Blackwater Valley, steep enough to discourage surveyors who liked rectangles, grew their own geometry of safety, cabins set where you could see who was coming, fields scratched into soil that would not tempt rich men, paths that bent like questions until outsiders lost interest. Geography turned the word into weather, constant, shaping, invisible to those who did not have to walk in it. To strangers, Melungeon sounded like a curiosity. To the Ridge families, it sounded like a knock you learn not to answer. The word also made kin out of strangers. Families with different origins, European, African, Native, found themselves braided by a label that refused to distinguish. In the ledger's eye, nuance meant nothing. Melungeon collapsed stories into one dark shape and called that justice. A man whose grandmother remembered a Saponi path and a woman whose grandfather was a free man of color from a tidewater county would shoulder the same name and the same penalties. Language did the flattening, law did the rest. What makes a slur endure is its usefulness. It is a tool that lets a society solve its anxieties with a single motion. Appalachia in the 19th century was a place of crossings, trade, war, migration, and crossings make categories leak. The word Melungeon sealed the leak by criminalizing the seam. It reassured those who needed reassurance that whiteness could be patrolled even where roads were mud and map lines shook with every thunderstorm. In pamphlets and pulpits, the term became a shorthand for disorder, the human version of a fence gone slack. Yet even as the word sorted, it slipped. People called Melungeon married, worked, paid taxes, raised children, and testified to their own belonging in ways that paper could not erase. Some families passed where they could, moving a valley over, changing a spelling, upholstering memory with silence, because survival sometimes requires costume. Others stayed and defied the category by making it ordinary. When a term built to shame becomes the name your grandmother uses for herself in the kitchen, its power splits, hurt keeps one half, endurance keeps the other. Listen to the texture of the word as neighbors used it, drawn out, thickened at the middle, sometimes lowered to a hush that made it sound like a sin, sometimes tossed like a pebble to see what ripples. Children learned early what to answer and what to ignore. Where are you from could mean, name your ridge or, prove your right to be here. Report cards might straighten a child's name while crooking their place. A preacher could hold you under water and call it baptism, a judge could hold you under language and call it law. Histories written far from the ridge tend to treat Melungeon as an ethnographic puzzle, a word to tease apart until its origins behave. But the people who had to wear it know better. The important part is not where the syllables came from, but how they were used to bind and unbind lives. Etymology may be a parlor game, classification is a sentence. When the 19th century record says Melungeon, it is not offering a footnote, it is closing a file. Even so, the term could not keep its own borders tight. Outsiders used it to frighten children, don't go up there after dark, and insiders used it to stitch pride into weathered cloth. A word that was meant to reduce became a vessel. Into it families poured survival strategies, jokes you only tell at home, recipes from 3 directions, names of cousins who arrive by road and by rumor. The label that marked them other became, grudgingly and then sturdily, a way of saying us without asking leave. Walk into a courthouse today and the ledgers still smell the same. You can flip to the page where some clerk's hand shook less from conscience than from coffee and find the word standing there, thin and sure of itself. You can also step outside and look up at a ridge where the same families taught their children a different alphabet, one of paths, springs, and faces that would answer when called. Between ink and hillside lies the battleground of identity in Appalachia, the paper that says what you are, and the place that says who you are. Melungeon is, finally, a name of shadows because it casts them and it hides in them. It was a weapon and a whisper, a category and a guess, a net thrown over people who kept slipping its mesh by insisting on their own ordinary lives. The word hurt. The word held. The word lingered long enough to become a chapter title in a history it once tried to erase. But a name, even a sharp one, is not an origin. Who were these people really, and where did they come from, by ocean rumor, river path, or the most American crossing of all, families finding each other where maps fail. From the courthouse page you have to climb, out of the column where Melungeon sits like a verdict and up into the blue-green where people made a living on slopes that don't forgive guesses. The country most often named is Hancock County, Tennessee, with Newman's Ridge running like a lifted knuckle and Blackwater Valley pooled in its shadow. On clear days you can see into Virginia and feel Kentucky in the weather, a tri-corner of hills where borders exist mostly on paper and in arguments. Cabins kept to the spine and the shoulder, where an afternoon sun could wring one more degree of warmth from winter and a cross breeze could carry summer's heat away. Smoke found its old exits, water found the springs that kept a family through dry spells. Paths stitched the houses like hand-sewn seams, narrow, practical, and purposeful. A ridge path gives you time to think about who's coming long before they arrive. That's a courtesy in country where names travel faster than people. The surnames repeat like verses: Collins, Gibson, Goins, Mullins, families braided by marriage and proximity until the tree looks less like a trunk with branches than a thicket with clearings. Children learned their hill in two languages, one of kinship and one of geography. Go fetch that from Aunt Lou's, meant, cross the saddle, keep the laurel on your left, look for the maple that forks low. A boy might be able to recite cousins out to third and fourth, a girl could name every fold in the ridge where water kept singing in August. The map you carry in your head becomes a kind of citizenship. The land was poor in the way that teaches invention. Fields could be coaxed from red clay and rock with enough sweat, enough patience, and a tolerance for crops that came up stubborn and light. Corn was the old reliable, beans were their shadow, sorghum sweetened what couldn't be sweetened otherwise. Hogs took the forest and turned it into food, a few cows, a mule if fortune allowed. Hunting was not a sport but a season, deer when you could, small game when you must. Ginseng and bloodroot were pocket money you dug with care and sold along back roads to men who knew exactly what they were paying for and made you guess. A woman's garden could decide a winter, a man's aim could mend a hungry month. Money was scarce enough to count in favors. Men traded days on each other's fields, traded timber hauled down switchbacks, traded the kind of help that doesn't need a ledger because everybody saw you give it. Women counted jars. They kept a cold room's arithmetic in their heads, a row of beans that meant February, a stack of peaches that meant company could be fed without shame, a crock of kraut that meant somebody had thought far ahead on a tired day. Church nights counted, too, hymns in minor keys, the talk after, the slow sorting of news into prayer and gossip. Outsiders took notes on faces. They wrote of olive skin that tanned deep, of dark hair glossy as a black snake, of eyes that could come out blue against all that dusk. They noticed straight features that read Mediterranean to minds eager for a story, high-bridged noses, certain jaws, and sometimes they noticed nothing beyond the fifth child stare from a threshold. The look was not a single look. The Ridge families showed their mixtures in 100 ways, the way any old place does when it's been at the crossroads long enough for blood to make its own choices. People who lived there did not bother to classify, they bothered to get wood in before the weather turned. Isolation was policy and refuge both. The mountains were walls you didn't have to build, and they did what walls do, kept you safer from strangers and closer to the people who could hurt you by knowing everything. When a road was cut, it gave and it took. You could bring salt and sugar in without planning a week around it. You could also expect a deputy or a tax man to arrive in a dry spell he'd never earned his understanding of. A new school meant a teacher with a syllabus and, perhaps, a list of words for categories that didn't match what the children had been taught to answer. In seasons when the Ridge families came down to market towns, the air changed, too. Paper mattered more. Questions came framed inside the law's curiosity. Where are you from? Asked by a clerk deciding what line to write in. A census man might admire a child's penmanship and then misspell the family name by a letter that would grow important later. Meanwhile, back on Newman's Ridge, the book that mattered was a family Bible with pages carefully inked, births, marriages, deaths, a counter-accounting against any courthouse that preferred erasure. The social weather ran to closed ranks. Marriages happened within the net of people who could be trusted, which looked to outsiders like secrecy and to insiders like the only sensible way to keep a home from being dismantled by rumor and rule. Outsiders called it clannishness and told the old jokes, ridge families called it keeping harm at bay. When someone did marry, off the ridge, they learned a new geography that included more polite parlors and less patience for answers that didn't fit easy boxes. Some stayed down there. Some came home with their papers better arranged and their eyes measuring road against ridge for the rest of their lives. Schoolhouses were proof of hope. Even where land pinched and the walk was unreasonable, a bell would ring on a weekday morning and children would sit on benches, names called in curls of chalk, readers handed down until the print blurred into memory. A teacher who understood the hill could make a scholar out of a boy whose hands were already calloused. A teacher who came to pronounce more than to teach would last one season, maybe two. Lessons were not limited to books. Children learned to read faces, too, when a man was mean-tired instead of mean, when a deputy was doing a job instead of making a point, when a question deserved an answer and when it deserved silence. Religion offered both aren't we all equal and who's in who's out. Brush arbor revivals might set the holler on sacred fire for a week, the call and response rolling over the ridge like thunder that refused to resolve. Sunday could make a community feel bigger than its harms. But pulpits could also echo the world's categories back into homes that already heard enough of them in more official voices. Melungeon might not be said from the front, but its weather could be felt in where people sat, whose children were invited to whose dinners, which hands met in peace and which stopped half an inch shy of a shake. If the hills trapped, they also taught, especially the lesson of noticing. People on Newman's ridge could tell a story from a boot mark and a landowner's plans from the angle of his hat. They could hear a car a quarter-mile away and call the model, they could hear a tone in a neighbor's greeting and call the week that lay ahead. That acuity kept food on tables, it also kept families from trusting the wrong promises. Outsiders came and wrote their articles, their ethnographies, their pieces bristling with adjectives. The ridge families read those with the same squint they used on Sky, what's it likely to do next? To stand on a shoulder of the ridge at dusk is to understand the equation that ran the place, enough sky to hold a hope, enough slope to check it. Children raced the path home as whippoorwills started their long, lonely verbs. Men finished the day's last act, one more armload of wood, one more look at a fence line. Women checked the stove and the jars and the small, vital quiets of a house at peace with itself. Somewhere down valley a dog spoke up, somewhere upslope a fox laughed to itself. In that music sat the knowledge that you were seen, not by a court, but by every eye that mattered. The ridge families did not need a grand narrative for who they were, they had work, kin, and hills to tell them. But the world beyond the ridges needed a story to file them under, and the story it liked best was the one that kept them half legend, half warning. The effect was predictable, isolation hardened into both shield and prison. People lived longer in the safety it gave and suffered longer under the attention it drew. Geography had made a room, rumor would try to kick the door. When you walk the old paths now, you still see the architecture of that life, a stone chimney standing where a house has gone to its boards, a pear tree fat with fruit no one planted this century, a terraced field reclaiming its wildness in careful diagonals, a springhead capped with rock and respect. You can put a palm on the worn sill of a window and feel the grain polished by hands that measured time in chores and children rather than in headlines. The place tells its own truth without a docent. Isolation protected them, but also made them targets for rumor. If geography built the room, then the question becomes, who first put the furniture inside? The theories of origin arrived next, Portuguese winds, Moorish prisoners, native paths, African routes, each carrying a light and a claim. Begin with a coast and end with a ridge, that is one way to describe the Melungeon origin story. Ships and shorelines people the earliest theories, footpaths and coves finish them. The middle is the part that matters, centuries of crossings where categories leaked and families did what families do, survive, merge, rename, keep going. Still, because we need beginnings, the stories arrange themselves like candles in a dark room. We'll light them one by one, knowing each throws more shadow than proof. The Portuguese wind. The most persistent tale blows in from the Atlantic. It says that somewhere between ship and shore, after storms, before records, Portuguese sailors were wrecked or marooned and pushed inland, finding in the blue folds of Appalachia a place as far from a mast as a man can get without dying. The evidence is mood and eyebrow, olive skin, dark hair, features outsiders read as Mediterranean. On paper, Portuguese did another kind of work. In a South that policed color with ledgers and laws, claiming Lusitanian ancestry could be a legal umbrella, foreign, yes, but European enough to argue a right to vote, to own, to belong. Courthouses heard the word and sometimes nodded. Neighbors heard the word and sometimes snorted. Either way, Portuguese became a story you could carry to town like a pass. Listen closely and you'll hear the truth inside the myth, not that sailors walked straight from a deck to a ridge, but that families learned how to sign their names through storms. In border counties where free people of color were pushed and reclassified, an old world identity could be the difference between a deed that stood and a deed that didn't, a child admitted to school or sent home. Whether any man on Newman's Ridge could have ordered wine in Lisbon is not the point. The point is that a word drifted in on a legal breeze and some people learned to tack with it. Moors, Turks, and the Roanoke Echo. Another story drapes itself in exotic cloth: Moors or Turks, Ottoman prisoners hauled to the New World and later loosed, or sailors of Muslim lands swept into England's quarrels and dumped on Outer Banks sands. There is a barrel of rumor that Sir Francis Drake, after raiding Spanish holds, released North African captives near Roanoke in the 1580s. From there, the tale climbs the coastal plain and the Piedmont like honeysuckle up a fence, taking root wherever a face confounds a census taker. Etymology lends gossip a grammar. Some hear in Melungeon the Turkish phrase Melungeon, cursed soul. Linguists raise eyebrows, historians shrug, locals remember the insult more than the dictionary. Here, again, what matters is the story's utility. Calling someone Turk in the hills could be a way to say, not us, without naming the American categories that carried punishment. The myth strides in with turbans and daggers. The reality probably arrived on sore feet from tidewater counties, speaking English like the neighbors and worrying the same weather. The native paths. Walk the ridge long enough and you begin to step in older footsteps. The Cherokee named these lands before the treaties renamed them. The Saponi and other Siouan-speaking peoples moved through the Piedmont in complex migrations. One elegant explanation holds that Melungeon families formed where native communities, pressured by war and land hunger, met European settlers and free Africans on the edges of maps, trading, hiring, marrying, making kin. This theory has documents you can touch, petitions, land grants, names that appear first under one tribal designation and later under county headings, surnames that leave one jurisdiction trailed by the anxious notation free. It also has the topology of common sense. Frontiers are places of barter, goods, ideas, vows. As colonial roads bit into the interior, as forts went up and towns went down, people with reasons to avoid scrutiny learned to recognize one another and built households out of that recognition. Melungeon, in this reading, is not an origin but a later label slapped over an already American story of mixture that needed no sail to explain it. The African thread. There are ledgers where the truth does not hide at all. In 18th and early 19th century Virginia and North Carolina, large populations of free people of color, of African and mixed ancestry, appear, taxed and tallied, marrying among themselves and sometimes into European and native families. When laws hardened and counties grew suspicious, many of these families followed the Appalachian spine into the interior, seeking the shelter that ridges give those who cannot afford a lawyer. Genealogists tracing Collins, Gibson, Goins, and allied lines have mapped migrations that start near the Chesapeake and edge westward, generation by generation, across the Dan, up the Holston, toward the Clinch. Court cases in later decades sometimes tried to pin those descendants back to Negro status, to strip a vote or a deed by reasserting a category. Against that pressure, stories like Portuguese and Turk look less like romance and more like tactics, not lies so much as life rafts. The African thread, when named aloud, cost you. Another thread, if it would hold, might carry you across. The lost colonies and other lamps. Every American mystery attracts Roanoke the way iron filings find a magnet. Some say that the lost colonists did not disappear, they dissolved into native communities, and that their English blood resurfaces, centuries later, in surnames and cheekbones along the ridge. Others float a Sephardic whisper, crypto-Jews fleeing Iberian pilgrims, finding in the Blue Ridge a refuge where Friday nights could be kept by lamplight and silence. These theories are beautiful in the way stained glass is beautiful. They color a room. They are also, for the Melungeons of Central Appalachia, candles without much wax. Family Bibles, tax rolls, and YDNA do not arrange themselves around such a single, dramatic route. The truth is messier, more American, and harder to costume. What the science says, and doesn't. In the 1990s and 2000s, the riddle met modern tools. Genealogists working surname by surname assembled paper trails that looked less like a straight line from a ship and more like a braid through courtrooms and coves. DNA projects, voluntary, imperfect, illuminating, tested the old claims against chromosomes. The broad result won't shock anyone who has stood on Newman's Ridge at dusk and counted the ways a face can be both familiar and new, triracial mixture. European lineages dominate many paternal lines, maternal lines often show both European and African haplogroups, Native American markers appear, sometimes plainly, sometimes faint as a waterline on stone. Science could say, this family's story is many stories, these ancestors came from several continents, the crossing happened here, and again here. But science could not referee identity. A swab can tell you something about your great-great-grandmother's mother's mother, it cannot tell a census man in 1830 what box he would have put her in, or how that box would have shaped her children's lives. Nor can it dissolve the social chemistry that turned Portuguese into a shield or Melungeon into a scar. DNA offers clarity, history offers context, neither cancels the other's truth. The braid, not the branch. The mistake is to demand a single root. Appalachia is not a tree, it's a thicket. What we call Melungeon emerges where routes cross, not where roots begin. Tidewater-free people of color, squeezed by statutes and neighbors, come inland. Scots-Irish and English settlers, poor and footsore, marry where affection and proximity allow. Native families, dislocated and relabeled, set up along new edges of old homelands. All of them learn the same mountain facts, how to farm poor ground, how to read a sky, how to speak little when speaking costs. Over generations, the braid tightens. Surnames repeat, kinship loops on itself, outsiders summarize difference with a single word. In one household, a grandmother remembers a Saponi song, in another, a grandfather swears his father came from the islands, and meant, perhaps, Madeira or perhaps a rumor that kept a deputy at bay. In a third, the Bible records births under a first spelling and marriages under another, because a clerk's quill made a decision alongside the families. Theories bloom where paper thins. In a county with missing marriage bonds and a habit of calling the ridge people, Portigi, the Portuguese lamp burns bright, in a valley where an antiquarian loved the word more, that lamp throws its shadow. But walk the distances on foot and the narrative simplifies, people moved into the folds the law couldn't easily reach and built community out of what, and whom, they had. Why the myths persist. If the genealogical math leans toward a many-sourced, thoroughly American origin, why do the older tales keep their shine? Because myth is a tool. It can dignify, protect, or distract. For families facing the humiliation of being labeled non-white by neighbors no richer and no kinder than themselves, Portuguese turned insult into ancestry, rumor into romance. For communities hungry to define themselves against an other, Turk or Moor, supplied a distance that excused cruelty without naming it. Folklore also flatters the listener, it lets us hold a secret and feel initiated, even as the secret we hold is our own prejudice dressed in velvet. There is another reason, the Gothic loves Appalachia. Ridges throw long shadows, cemeteries lift out of ferns, a name spoken low sounds like a spell. Into that atmosphere, stories march better than statistics. A sailor stepping from a wreck into a laurel thicket makes better television than a tax list that follows a family from Halifax County to the Clinch River. But if you want to know who lit the lamp in a ridge cabin, the tax list will tell you, plain as day. What the families say. Ask descendants, some who embrace the name Melungeon, some who refuse it, some who live beside it, and you hear variations on one theme: we were here, we belonged, we were made to prove it too often. A grandmother might say, Portigi, with a smile that mixes defiance and weariness. A nephew might point to a cheekbone and a photograph. A cousin might show you DNA results on a phone with 3 continents lit up like a constellation, then shrug, we always knew. The families are not waiting for a final answer so much as for the questions to be asked without malice. The candle and the ledger. So where does that leave the origins question? Between the candle and the ledger. The candle is the story you tell at night to ease or elevate the truth: sailors, Moors, lost colonies, secret synagogues on a ridge. The ledger is the document that shows the actual movement of names across counties and years, the marriages that closed distances, the court fights that opened wounds. In the light of both, the picture resolves: a triracial, frontier-forged people, born from the crossings of European settlers, often poor and marginal, free and enslaved Africans, many later free and migrating, and native communities pressured into new shapes, and then labeled by outsiders with a word that pretended all that complexity could be reduced to one syllable. But origins, however tangled, do not explain the price. The next chapter is uglier and plainer: how a name on a line could strip a vote, how a rumor could bar a child from school, how law became the blade that made Melungeon hurt. Before the gossip, there was government. Long before a neighbor could ruin you with a sentence, a clerk could ruin you with a single word in a ledger. In the upland south of the 1800s, identity was a filing system, not a philosophy. The categories were simple because the consequences were not. A checkmark in the wrong column could reach into your field, your pocket, your pew, your children's futures. For families the neighbors called Melungeon, law was not an abstraction, it was weather, ambient, shaping, unavoidable. Start with the vote. In the early decades of the century, free people of color in portions of the South could and did vote, then constitutional rewrites and new statutes narrowed the door. Lines hardened. White became not only an idea but an eligibility requirement. If a registrar suspected your blood did not match your face, a right could vanish like a road into fog. Word traveled uphill: town is where the paper lives, paper is where a stranger can decide who you are in front of witnesses. Then property. A deed is a promise you can hold in your hands, until a court says you were never allowed to make it. County cases, now brittle in archives, show neighbors contesting land on the ground that a man was colored and therefore incompetent in law to buy, sell, or testify as a white man. The proceeding might begin with a boundary dispute and end in a lineage trial. Your grandparents' names became exhibits. Your skin became an argument. The surveyor's chain suddenly had a racial quotient. Marriage was the third blade. Anti-miscegenation laws reached into kitchens and cradles, criminalizing unions across lines that the community was busy redrawing whenever it needed leverage. A minister might bless a couple who looked like every other couple in the valley, then watch as a court unblessed them later because an enemy whispered a lineage and a clerk believed it. Children woke one morning legitimate and went to bed that night as a legal problem. The Ridge families learned the countermeasures: marry where the minister knew you, where the record would be kept in a Bible as well as a book, where kin could crowd a courtroom if needed and say, with 100 steady eyes, that you belonged. Schools became border posts. A teacher's role could sort children as efficiently as a registrar's book. In some counties, Ridge children found a chair only in mission schools built specifically because the public ones would not seat them. A bell rang on the Ridge, and the lesson was double: reading and writing, and also how to walk around a law designed to keep you illiterate. The walls of those little schools held 2 kinds of maps: the United States in cheap ink, and the local map in muscle and memory, which storekeeper would sell, which preacher would baptize, which courthouse door was safer to open after harvest than before. Accusation was its own instrument. Witchcraft in whispers, degenerate, in print, incest, in court when the real complaint was clannishness born of self-defense. Gossip is cheaper than evidence and often spends better. A woman who married a cousin because outside families would not have her became proof of the rumor that forced the marriage. A man who stayed on the ridge because hiring off it came with humiliations became proof he was shiftless. Circular logic, straight penalty. Some laws did their work at a distance. State registrars and health officials, men with tidy desks and tidy theories, sent letters down the spine of the mountains insisting that mixed communities be reclassified, renamed, erased into categories that fit policy rather than reality. In one state, the one-drop mentality was stamped into birth and marriage certificates with a bureaucrat's certainty. In another, the census man took one look and wrote what he'd been told to see. Paper flowed downhill like rain, and the ridge families built culverts where they could. But law, even when it cuts, teaches counter skills. People learned how to answer questions with stories that would travel across a desk intact. Portuguese could roll off the tongue smoother than a truth that came with punishments attached. Indian could sometimes ease a door open that colored would slam. Neither claim was necessarily untrue in a family whose tree bent across 3 continents. Both were tactically true in counties where the difference between a Y and an I in your surname could cost you a harvest. Passing became a verb with gravity. Some families stepped off the ridge entirely and began again a county or 2 away, with a new spelling and a new silence. The work is exacting. Learn which relative is now a friend, which town you can never visit, which childhood stories you keep only for the darkest winter nights. Passing isn't betrayal. It's an indemnity policy written in quiet. Others refused it, stayed rooted, and took the slow punishment of always being measured. Within the ridge communities, survival strategy looked less like romance and more like habit. Marry trusted names. Keep copies of deeds where fire and malice cannot find them. Tell children the rules of the road before they can read them. Yes, sir, to deputies who do not deserve it. Eye contact where it's safe. Silence where it is not. Write down births as if a court will ask you to testify against your own memory. Save money for the year the sheriff arrives with a smile that says it won't be enough. Church absorbed some of the pressure and reflected some of it back. The gospel promised a category above categories, and on good Sundays you could feel it, hands lifted in a single key, testimony spoken from mouths that the weekday world tried to shut. But on other Sundays, the pews themselves became a reminder that the world had seeped in, the polite distance, the absence of invitations across certain thresholds, the way communion can meet you and miss you in the same cup. The law's knife cut along the grain of rumor. A jury populated by people who already said your name with a curl could be trusted to find your blood impure when your land grew valuable. Courtrooms and courtyards echoed each other. A verdict did not have to be written to be lived. Merchants extending short credit and long suspicion, constables remembering your name during a dry raid, employers discovering you were not quite what they wanted after your hands had already proved otherwise. And yet, life carried on because life insists. The ridge families did not turn their days into protest, they turned them into supper, harvest, weddings pronounced under homemade arches of laurel. If the county tried to starve them of institutions, they made their own, schools where they were welcomed, congregations where their children ran the aisles without being counted like livestock, burial grounds on land that did not require permission. A woman who could not sign her name wrote her lineage in quilts only family can read. A man who could not win a case in town resolved disputes under a beech tree with cousins as jurors and the memory of grandfathers as law. There were small victories that do not fit in books. A clerk who quietly chose not to scratch through the line that would have ruined a marriage license. A deputy who walked past a still everyone knew about because the family needed the money and because the valley needed the medicine. A teacher who brought extra readers and pretended the county had provided them. These are not triumphs, they are stitches. Communities survive with 1,000 of them. There were also costs that compound. Silence is expensive. When you do not tell your children certain truths because those truths are dangerous, they inherit a map with missing roads. When you change a name to spare a son the pain of explaining it, you also cut him off from some inheritance that would have steadied him. When you accept an insult as the price of doing business, the insult does not get cheaper, it gets familiar. The ledger of harm is intergenerational, so is the ledger of endurance. By the early 20th century, modernity arrived in the valleys with cameras and curiosity. Journalists and researchers came hunting a mystery race and found, to their disappointment or delight, ordinary people with complicated papers. Some wrote with humanity. Others wrote like collectors, pinning lives to boards and labeling them in tidy Latin. Academic attention could be gentler than a judge's gavel, but it still assumed the right to name. The Ridge families learned to offer hospitality without surrendering sovereignty. If you were polite, you got coffee. If you were intrusive, you got directions back to the highway. And still, for many descendants, the safest posture was quiet. You cannot be reclassified if you are unremarked. You cannot be accused of marrying wrong if no one knows whom you married. You cannot be denied the vote in a county where no one remembers your grandfather's hearing. Silence protects, it also builds echo chambers. Inside them, pride and shame learn to share a wall. What the law produced, over a century and more, was not just hardship, it produced a style of survival, frugal, observant, careful with names, agile with stories, distrustful of headlines, loyal to the ridge. In that style you can hear the old American music of people who learned to live just outside the reach of those who would number them and use the number as a weapon. The result, to outside eyes, looked like secrecy. To inside eyes, it looked like wisdom. And because the public hates what it cannot inventory, folklore rushed in, witch talk, cursed blood, the rumor that graves would not hold them, that water would not take them, that they were a people born from a story rather than from other people. Those fictions, and the fear they served, would grow fat in the shade cast by law. The statutes built the room, the stories furnished it. Next, the mountain imagination goes to work, turning families into phantoms and caution into curse. The statutes built the room, the stories furnished it. Once the ledgers had labeled the Ridge families, the rest of the community began decorating that label with rumor. Folklore works fast in small places because explanation is a social need. A child asks, "Who are they?" and the quickest answer is a tale. Over time, tales harden into furniture, chairs everyone sits on without remembering who brought them in. The themes were old, difference becomes danger, secrecy becomes sorcery. In the valleys you could hear a mother lean down to a child at dusk, "Don't stray to the ridge after sundown. The Melungeons will get you." Get you was left undefined on purpose, vagueness scares better than detail. Teenage bravado added the specifics that parents pretended not to believe, graves that would not hold them, water that would not take them, a baby born with a caul who could see through a man's lies. No one needed proof, they needed a shape to put around their unease. Witchcraft accusations, the oldest fuel in the rumor economy, stuck easily. Appalachia has always had its granny women, midwives and yarb doctors who knew when bone-set tea helps and when it doesn't, who stored knowledge in hands rather than in books. Outsiders, watching a birth turned by skill or a fever turned by willow bark, could mistake competence for a cult. If the woman was of a Ridge family, dark-haired, keen-eyed, quiet, then the medicine might be called witchery the next time the patient failed. That is how credit and blame travel on the same road. Signs and remedies, burying a wart in a potato, cutting shingles with a silver coin, talking fire out of a burn, became evidence in the wrong mouths. Water witching with a forked branch for a new well was either craft or curse depending on who owned the pasture. People forget that these practices were general Appalachian inheritance, they remembered only that the Ridge people excelled at them, which made the Ridge people convenient repositories for fear. Stories swapped religion for spectacle at revivals. Brush arbor meetings could turn a week electric, so could the gossip that whispered along the edges, "They can't be baptized, the water spits them out." It is nonsense, but good nonsense, built to travel. By Sunday night, the line had grown, they float like wood, the preacher's hand shakes, the creek runs backward. In the telling, the Ridge families became the community's test of orthodoxy. If your faith was strong enough, the water would take them, if it didn't, perhaps the devil had hung a palm on their door. No ledger recorded this, rumor didn't need ink. More grotesque stories wandered in from other counties and found a home, whispers of cannibalism in hard winters, as if the valley had not known hunger, whispers that certain families had 6 fingers, as if polydactyly did not visit every population at the same small odds, whispers that they had no shadows, as if noon were a spell. Hyperbole fed on isolation. Few valley people visited Newman's Ridge at night. The distance between, "I haven't seen it," and, "it cannot be seen," shrank to a hair. Newspapers helped when they needed copy during the quiet weeks between fairs and floods. A late 19th century feature piece could do brisk business by promising readers a mystery race hidden in the hills, photographs posed to look ethnographic, captions written to sound clinical, neither white nor black, curious habits, degenerate tribe. Editors learned the prophet in a shiver. The Ridge families learned their names printed wrong on paper that would outlive their corrections. Even kinder writers could not resist tone. Curiosity, when you're the specimen, can feel like cruelty pronounced in a soft voice. Carnivals and medicine shows borrowed the image, too. A barker could pitch a tent on a courthouse square and sell tickets to a Turkish girl or a Moorish prince from the mountain. Costumed names hung on local features. The audience knew, or half knew, that this was theater. Theater still teaches. Children learn to fit the word Melungeon to a face the way they learn to fit a hymn to a tune. Meanwhile, inside the Ridge, pride built its own countermyths, not to frighten outsiders but to bind insiders. A family recipe said to be older than the county, a certain way of plaiting hair, a story about a great-grandmother who hid a cousin from a draft officer or a revenue man. These were told with a hum at the end that said, "We know who we are." Some of those stories touched the old theories, Portuguese, Moorish, Indian, not as a camouflage but as heritage. You could hold both truths, that the labels had been used against you, and that some of the past they guessed it was yours in fact. Silence did as much work as speech. The safest policy in a courthouse world was to keep your history folded small. Secrets became heirlooms. But secrecy is fog, it protects and it distorts. A child taught never to answer certain questions grows up inside a narrowed vocabulary. The neighbors, watching that reticence, decide the gaps prove their suspicions. Folklore loves a locked door. It will always choose ghost over latch. Fear wraps itself in etiquette. Valley families taught boundaries, don't bring one home, and disguised the directive as advice about hard living or staying with your kind. Church ladies turned prayer requests into census work. Young men turned jokes cruel at the end of a workday to mark who belonged. A slur thrives when people can pretend it was never spoken. Melungeon could be said with a tilt of the head rather than with the mouth. And yet, in quiet ways, the stories also revealed admiration. The Ridge families were said to be tireless walkers, deadshot hunters, uncanny with weather. A woman could read a child's fever like a clock. A man could hear a storm crossing 2 ridges away. Admiration wrapped in superstition is still admiration. In a region where survival often depended on attention, the people most attentive were given a second sight by rumor. By the early 20th century, as roads cut switchbacks into the ridges and schoolhouses drew children into shared rooms, the folklore didn't die, it changed clothes. Medical men and university researchers arrived with notebooks. Some came looking to debunk, others came looking to be amazed. Both arrived with frameworks that could flatten a life into a case study. A photograph of a dark-haired child in bare feet looks different on a campus wall than it did in a kitchen. The same stories that once warmed a winter night were translated into footnotes. Community lore became data, less cruel than gossip, often more useful, but still a version. Controversies bloomed in that new light. When genealogists began to link families across counties, when DNA studies later added their blunt arithmetic, European, African, native in a triracial braid, old rumors lost their magic but not their momentum. Some descendants accepted the clarity as a relief. Others resisted, not because the numbers were wrong, but because lived identity had been negotiated in a hostile marketplace. A lab could not renegotiate it safely. To say aloud what had always been camouflaged could feel like painting a target on your own door. Inside the broader Appalachian imagination, the Melungeon tale took its seat among familiar specters, Mothman sightings, cold camp haints, the buried baby who taps on windowpanes when the fog comes low. But unlike those free-floating ghosts, this specter had addresses and surnames. The gravity of real people anchored the myth, and so the myth demanded more care. A story told lazily could do harm, a story told carefully could heal. The same folklore that once excluded could, retold, serve as confession. We made monsters to explain neighbors, we turned difference into dread because we didn't want to think about law. Even now, on certain porches, you hear both versions, the old fright and the newer correction, sitting side by side like kin who don't speak. An elder will half-joke about graves that won't hold, and a granddaughter will say, soft but firm, hush now, we know better. Knowledge does not kill a story, it teaches it manners. And this is the haunting truth, folklore filled the silence that persecution created. When law barred doors, rumor furnished the empty rooms with fear. When families survived by being quiet, tales spoke in their place. The result is a house built by both enemies, statutes and stories, standing solid on the ridge. By the 20th century, scholars, genealogists, and, later, DNA began peeling superstition off the walls. Some cheered. Some flinched. Next comes the uneasy light of rediscovery, researchers with clipboards, families with Bibles, and a swab that can confirm what a grandmother always knew, without deciding who gets to belong. The first people to come, studying, did not bring answers, they brought angles. Turn-of-the-century journalists arrived with cameras and adjectives, hawking a mystery race to readers who wanted Appalachia to be both close and safely strange. They took portraits with the pitying patience reserved for exhibits, filed copy rich in wonder and thin in citation, and left behind a paper echo that would outlive correction. Early academics weren't always kinder. Some wrote as collectors, pinning families to boards with Latin labels, triracial isolate, degenerate clan, phrases that sound like diagnoses and feel like verdicts. But a different kind of researcher followed, genealogists with stubborn eyes and courthouse grit. They did not hunt curiosities, they hunted records. They read the loops of old hands on tax lists, the courtroom's dry prose, the smudged names in family Bibles. The method was dull and holy, witness after witness, deed after deed, marriage bonds stapled to wills, a surname watching itself change a letter to dodge a law or to please a clerk. The picture that emerged was not mythic. It was human and particular, Collins's walking the river valleys westward, Gibson's appearing in one county as free people of color and in the next as farmers who knew to answer, Portuguese, when the questions turned sharp, Goins's marrying where the ridge allowed and the courthouse didn't. The archive said what folklore had refused to, the Melungeon story was not an island sprung fully formed from exotic sand, it was a braid laid down over generations. The braid crossed through Tidewater counties and Piedmont roads, through Cherokee and Saponi paths, through the legal eddies where white and free-colored were argued with the ferocity of property disputes. Each document dimmed a candle of speculation and lit a lamplight in a kitchen where a woman turned a page with flour on her fingers. Then came the plastic tube and the postage stamp, DNA in the mail, the 1990s turning bloodlines into barcodes. Community-led surname projects invited volunteers to swab, to learn, to see if the stories could bear laboratory light. Results returned with the blunt beauty of numbers and the delicate cruelty of percentages. On the paternal side, Y-DNA, many lines read broadly European, haplogroups marching in from the Atlantic with the surnames that carried them. Maternal lines, mtDNA, told a more various tale, European in many families, yes, but also African haplogroups that had crossed an ocean in chains and then walked inland in hope, and Native American lineages showing up like creek lines on a winter map, some bold, some faint, but unmistakable. Autosomal tests, those democratic summaries of all your ancestors, not just one line, painted tricontinental portraits, their colors shifting with the generations as recombination did its quiet mosaic work. Science, careful when it is honest, also said what it could not do. A haplogroup does not restore a missing page in an 1810 register. A percentage does not reseat a great-grandfather in the pew where a deacon once moved him away. DNA cannot tell a sheriff in 1902 to holster his prejudice. It cannot ask a teacher in 1931 to hand a reader to a child she has already filed in her mind. It can say, your people come from here and here and here, while the law still insists that where you are allowed to stand is only there. In this tale, genetics is a lantern, history is the map, neither will get you home without the other. As the tests multiplied, so did reactions. Some descendants felt relief, the quiet thrill of seeing a grandmother's whispered, we're part Indian, or a grandfather's blunt, we've got African in us, affirmed in a scatterplot. The ghost of rumor finally met a number and nodded. Others flinched. Identity is not a lab report, it is a long negotiation with neighbors and gatekeepers. In a world where one drop had been used as a sword, giving percentages to strangers felt like laying a new whetstone on the table. Families who had survived by closing the door learned to say no to the cheerful insistence of citizen science. The right to remain unstudied is a kind of sovereignty, too. A few embraced the name Melungeon with a defiant tenderness, making heritage groups, writing newsletters, telling the story in their own voices. Reunions sprouted on Newman's Ridge and in towns that had once required paperwork for permission to belong. People brought recipes and photographs, court copies and cheekbones. They argued, lovingly and not, about which parts of the old theories deserved a dignified burial and which deserved a careful retelling. They made space for both pride and pain, quilts stitched with surnames, panels on legal discrimination, tables where you could swab if you wished and brochures if you did not. The act of gathering said what the law once denied, we exist, we know ourselves, and we will write the caption beneath our own picture. Others stepped aside. I'm not a Melungeon, some said, meaning, I will not use the slur that used me. Or, my family outran that word by 3 counties, and I will not slow down for it now. Both stances make sense when a label has been both rope and bridge. The rediscovery years taught outsiders a lesson Appalachia already knew, kinship is consent. You cannot assign an identity the way a clerk once could. You ask, you wait, you honor the answer. Academia, on its better days, learned new manners. Scholars from history, folklore, anthropology, and genetics began to share rooms and sources. A case study could start with a grandmother's song, move through a deed book, and end with a haplogroup without treating the woman, the clerk, or the lab as props. The term, triracial isolate, once tossed like a net, slowly frayed, in its place came messier, better phrases, mixed ancestry communities, frontier kin networks, localized ethnogenesis. The jargon improved by admitting ignorance. A footnote that says, uncertain, is sometimes the most honest sentence in a book. Meanwhile, the wider culture discovered the comfort and chaos of percentages. Television made spectacles of reunions, kits offered sales on holidays, social media lit up with pie charts. For Melungeon descendants, the trend was double-edged. On the one hand, America was finally learning, publicly, what the Ridge had lived privately, that blood does not respect the boxes, that families are federations, that whiteness was always a boundary dispute disguised as a virtue. On the other hand, a carnival of ancestry risks turning hard history into entertainment, look at my 2%, while the ledger of harm sits, unpaid, in the room. If the rediscovery period gave any single gift, it was the recentering of voice. Oral histories were recorded with the courtesy of consent. Elders told how teachers had looked past their raised hands, how sheriffs had mispronounced their names on purpose, how marriages had been planned like heists to get around a registrar. Middle generations spoke about learning to pass in one county and deciding not to in the next. Younger ones talked about a different burden, how to honor ancestors whose survival required silence while choosing speech as a form of repair. The science kept refining. Newer tests complicated the early simplifications, showing how drift and recombination can make siblings look like different continents, how a great-great-grandparent can disappear in your percentages without disappearing from your story. Projects expanded beyond Y and mtDNA to autosomal triangulation with cousins, proof by kinship rather than by line alone. The findings always return to the same Appalachian sentence, half shrug, half him, we knew already, now we can show you. And so, the rediscovery years did not solve the Melungeon mystery so much as change its subject. The question became less what are they? And more what did we do to them, and how do we tell that truth without repeating the harm? The archive and the lab, together, pried off some of the folklore's darker furniture and carried it to the curb. In its place went the plain chairs of document and testimony, the steady table of community voice. For the Ridge families, identity remained what it had always been, work. A daily apprenticeship to belonging, who you claim, who claims you back, and how to live with both the ledger and the lamp. Some wear Melungeon gladly now, sanding the word's edges with use until it fits the hand. Some keep it on a high shelf, an heirloom you dust but do not display. Some toss it and walk out the door, headed for a county where nobody asks and you don't have to answer. Whether welcomed or refused, the name has already carved itself into Appalachian memory. The last chapter is not an origin or a test result, it's a reckoning, what the word means now, what it teaches about the borders we drew, and the twilight legacy the ridges keep. A word that once functioned like a verdict now sits in syllabi, archives, and family group chats. Melungeon, the slur that closed doors, has become a case study, a heritage label, a lightning rod, a word some descendants hold and others refuse. That arc is the American one, we rename the harm, then argue about who owns the new name. In the ridges and valleys where the story began, the shift is quieter. People still plant gardens on the same slopes, sing in the same minor keys, and teach children the old etiquette, answer when called, keep papers dry, learn the creek's moods. The legacy is not an exhibit, it is a way of moving through a place where categories once walked ahead of you like armed men. What the history finally shows is less exotic than the myths and more radical than the insults. Appalachia's isolation did not preserve a mystery race so much as it exposed the seams of American identity, how law, rumor, and terrain stitched together lives that bureaucracies tried to tear along racial lines. In that exposure resides the lesson. The Ridge families reveal how rigid lines fracture under the pressure of real households, European men who arrived with not much more than their surnames, African-descended families who rebuilt freedom again and again, native kin who redefined homelands under duress. The Melungeons are not proof of an elsewhere, they are proof of a here, the crossing that America has always been. Science has cleared part of the fog, but not the weather. DNA charts that paint 3 continents do not erase the century when a clerk's pen decided whether you could vote, wed, testify, or learn. Nor do they cancel the complicated dignity of the stories people told to survive, Portuguese, Turk, Indian, tactics that felt like shields in rooms where truth cost money and safety. The lab's clarity is useful, the ledger's history is necessary. Put together, they do what good light does, they show the furniture without rearranging the house for you. The choice of how to sit with the word Melungeon, to adopt it, archive it, or lay it down, belongs to the people who have borne it. Folklore has not vanished, it has quieter manners. The old fright talk, witches, cursed blood, graves that won't hold, no longer passes unchallenged. In its place, communities practice a different ritual, confession. We tell on our past selves. We admit the convenience of turning neighbors into shadows because it spared us the cost of changing the law. In that confession there is room for the Ridge family's private pride, recipes saved, kin charts memorized, hymns carried through winters, and for the public work of repair, school lessons that name the discrimination, museum exhibits curated by descendants, reunions that serve both home cooking and footnotes. Online, the story has gathered hashtags, hashtag family secrets, hashtag dark history, because the internet loves a mood. If those tags help people find the archive and not just the aesthetic, let them stand. The deeper current is older than any platform, families deciding what to keep lit and what to keep folded. For some, reclaiming Melungeon is an act of tenderness toward ancestors who endured it. For others, the truest honor is to leave the word in the courthouse where it harmed, and speak instead of Collins, Gibson, Goins, Mullins, of Newman's Ridge and Blackwater Valley, of kitchens and springs and the stubborn math of survival. Institutions have learned, imperfectly, to listen. Historians bring document and doubt in equal measure. Folklorists record with consent. Geneticists footnote their limits. Teachers in nearby counties assign readings that do not exoticize. Park rangers and small museums install panels that begin with voice, not with the researcher's premise. None of this undoes the past. It does, however, place responsibility where it belongs, on the systems that sorted and punished, rather than on the families that endured the sorting. And still the aura remains, not because the people are uncanny, but because the place is. Ridges throw long dusk, unmarked graves graze the edges of field and forest, a surname spoken softly can pull 3 centuries into a single kitchen. The Gothic is not a costume here, it is the acoustics of memory. When twilight lifts across Newman's Ridge, you can feel the double exposure, the visible present, satellite dishes tilted to the southern sky, school buses grumbling the switchbacks, and the invisible ledger of former names, altered papers, careful marriages, and long walks home taken the back way. That double image is the Melungeon legacy's atmosphere, half history, half legend, fully human. If there is a caution to carry forward, it's this: our urge to classify is older than our urge to understand. The word Melungeon survives as evidence. It testifies that a label can function like a gate, and that once a gate is built, stories rush in to justify it. The counter-testimony is the lives themselves, the ordinary abundance of households that refuse to be reduced. Their endurance teaches a better category, neighbor. It is less precise and more moral. Final image, a ridge at twilight. Fog kneels in the saddles. A child runs a narrow path, chasing a dog that knows the way home by heart. Under a stand of locusts, fieldstones lean, no names, only the quiet certainty of presence. From the valley, a hymn rises thin and brave. On the porch, someone opens a box, letters, deeds, a photograph with 4 faces and 1 bent corner. The air holds both the ache and the answer. The Melungeons remind us that family history can be both curse and inheritance, an injury inflicted by law and rumor, and a lineage tended in kitchens and on ridges until it blooms into identity. Their story lingers in shadows not because they were unknowable, but because society preferred them that way. Knowing better is the beginning of belonging better.